Let me introduce our guests. We have a distinguished panel with us today. On the end is Jeremy Pearson, Director of San Rafael Energy Research Center. And then we have Gaywin Quantz, CEO, co-founder, Solid Carbon Products, LLC, former Emergency Preparedness Exercise Director, and Reactor Safety Operations Audit Team Leader for Ontario Hydro Nuclear. And then we have Dr. Jess Jean, Associate Laboratory Director, Idaho National Laboratory. Tim Kowalczyk, Emerging Technology Strategist, Utah Office of Energy Development. Then we have, sorry, this is out of order, so I'm finding everyone in here. Dr. Matthew Nemeth, Associate Professor at Brigham Young University. And Joyce Open, Board of Directors, Flight Energy, thorium-based nuclear company. So thank you all for being here. This is an important discussion, and you have to start somewhere. So why not here in Eagle Mountain? Eagle Mountain is a leader, and we intend to continue to lead. I've been impressed that the attention that even this meeting has gotten around the state and around the country. And we're not going to solve any problems tonight, but we're going to begin the discussion. And definitely the place to start is by informing and educating ourselves and learning all that we can about energy so that we can make good decisions going forward. So ever since Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla battled each other on alternating current and direct current back in the late 1800s and launched America in front of the world with a new way of doing things, getting things done more effectively, more efficiently, and healthier by the use of electricity. And electricity and the United States of America have been interlinked ever since. Well, with our growth and as our lifestyles and technology move forward, we become ever more reliant on that electricity. And at the same time, we have concerns about quality of life. We want to keep our air clean, and there are only so many hydroelectric dams that can be built. And coal has its issues. There are no easy answers. However, we know that with our growth, with technology, with our personal demand and need for electricity to power all of our electronic devices, to power our homes, to keep our food cold, and to keep our lives running smoothly, we need electricity. So as we explore the options, this shouldn't be just us relying on government to do. We have to figure out our answers. We have to figure out the best solutions. And currently Eagle Mountain is exploring every option available. We have, there's been exploration on geothermal, and that's a technology that's moving forward that we'll be looking at. We know about wind, we know about solar, there are fuel cells, there's natural gas, etc. There are many different technologies, including nuclear, and even within the nuclear world, and I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit about that tonight, there are multiple ways to use nuclear, multiple technology, and multiple approaches. So I'm grateful that you're all here. We can boldly move forward and look for the best options to resolve our energy needs. And so with that, we asked for questions from residents or anyone for that matter, and we can start out. Are we starting out with questions, or let me see. Okay, so we'll get to the questions in a moment, but we'll let each of our panel participants address us for a bit and give us some of their perspective on energy, the need for energy, and the emerging technologies and their interactions with it. So, Joyce, can we start with you?
Start with me. So my name is Joyce Halpin. I promise that's a Utah name. My mom was from Sanpete County. So raise your hand. This is a small gathering. Raise your hand if you've heard of Nephi. That's where I grew up. I spent 61 years there. Honestly, I wish I was still there. The only one that I know on this panel is Matt Bennett, I've been with before. But when I was young, I thought I wanted to be an engineer. The girl that I was dating said, no, you want to work at this power plant. Okay. So I worked at Intermountain Power until I could retire. I lost my hair and then I could retire. So I've killed the planet twice. So Matt told me not to mention coal, but Intermountain Power is a coal-fired power plant. At the time, I was just getting a job. I was just doing what at the time, my girlfriend asked me to do, was to get a job. And I was working construction. I thought I was the cat's meow. I was living with my mom and dad, and I was working federal road construction. So I've had you raise your hand once. Remember when the freeway used to go past Nephi? Well, I mean through Nephi, sorry. I worked for the company that helped it was the last job I had working heavy construction, taking the freeway past Nephi. So Intermountain Power has definitely paid my tuition, or my kids' tuitions and everything associated with that. The reason I moved up to Lehigh was I was following the kids a little bit. So one thing I've noticed in Nephi when I was younger was that you couldn't get a breath of fresh air in Utah unless you went up into the mountains. Or at the time I was a skier, I wouldn't dare go skiing now, my bones wouldn't take it. But if you came down from the ski resorts, you could see a problem that Utah has, which is the inversion. And my daughter, I don't know where she gets this from, she doesn't get it from me. She likes to exercise. She likes to take her 2 kids and go pushing the youngest in a stroller and go walking for, I think it's 3 or 4 miles, which may not seem like a lot to you folks, but it's more than I want to do. And before she leaves, she checks the air quality index. And in the winter months, sometimes she either has to go or not go. And she makes up for it later. I don't know how she makes up for it, because I'm in my bed cutting Z's, doing Z's. But I have 4 kids, 3 boys who live in Saratoga Springs, and my daughter who works as a nurse, and she works at Utah Valley, and she lives in Lehigh. So we moved from Nephi to Lehigh, and I've spoken up.
I'm Matt Bennett. I work at Brigham Young University, grew up in Centerville, Utah. Got a degree in chemical engineering from BYU. Got a master's and PhD from MIT in nuclear engineering. And then went to work at Westinghouse, where I led the advanced reactor group, designing new reactors. Worked on the AP1000 on the small modular reactor, on their pebble bed reactor that we were from South Africa, lead reactor, sodium reactor, every kind of reactor you can imagine except for salt reactors. The fuel was too cheap for Westinghouse to be interested in. And about 10 years ago, BYU reached out to me and wanted me to come apply for a job because they had over half their engineering students were really interested in nuclear engineering, and there was no nuclear engineering program at the Y. The U had one, but well, we won't go there. So, great school, great program, but loyalties. So I ended up going down to BYU, and there at BYU had started doing research on molten salt reactors, and have done extensive work with molten salt reactors, and we've been fortunate enough to address some of the key issues people are concerned with and develop a lot of cool technology out of there that will really benefit. And we'll talk about it tonight, I'm sure, some of the benefits of these new advanced reactors, including that the waste can be managed and completely eliminated even, depending on how you deal with that. As well as the fact that some of these reactors are so incredibly safe that if something goes wrong, including if a missile were to strike this reactor, everything would freeze in place, it would shut down, and you could walk away after somebody vacuumed up the pieces that froze before they hit the ground. That kind of safety, I mean, it's incredible the advancements that nuclear technology has taken. I think one of the big challenges that we run into when it comes to nuclear is the perception and the fear because of radiation. And it's been mentioned that radiation is bad and no radiation is a good amount of radiation. We can talk about this more tonight, but really, in reality, the world is awash with radiation. And if we can't handle even the slightest bit of radiation, we should not be living on the planet. In fact, we probably shouldn't be married because your spouse is dosing you with radiation every single night. Because we are a little bit radioactive. So we can talk about that, but I think that understanding the real scientific information will help people to be a little more comfortable with the ideas here. And the fact that the regulators have gone to great lengths to make sure that this is really the safest kind of electricity generation that the world has seen. That's not always recognized because of a lot of the emotion and the perception and the misunderstandings, but that's the reality, is that nuclear really is incredibly safe. Happy to talk about details, that's why we're here tonight.
Hello, Tim Kowalczyk. I'm the Emerging Technology Strategist for the Office of Energy Development. And I want to back us out a little bit. So we're going to hear a lot about the benefits of nuclear, why it's great, why it's fantastic. It's clean, it's the cleanest resource. It's safe, it's the safest resource. But why is the state particularly interested? So the office is sort of under the governor or under the legislature. We will try to get policy done to do energy within the state, within the governor's sort of mandates. Utah has 7 sort of characteristics that we're supposed to pursue, which will probably be news to many of you. It's been news to a whole lot of people. Energy should be adequate, reliable, dispatchable. That's how you use your energy. If we think about nuclear in that context, it is all of those things. It's more than adequate. You can control it. France alone proved that you could ramp this stuff up and down if you'd like to. Energy should be affordable. We'll touch on that one in a second. That's contentious with nuclear. And then the other 3 are secure, safe, and sustainable. We heard a little bit from Matt that it's certainly secure, it's certainly clean. You can run a missile into these things. They are so designed for safety that you might not even know they were there necessarily, minus a giant cooling tower that's sort of iconic, but you can't tell from the radiation. The mandates around them are remarkable. Incredibly safe, incredibly secure. Small modulars are going down an interesting pathway within that idea. They're sort of new. They're new for kind of everybody. So a lot of what I imagine the conversation here will be about, well, what's the future look like? What is going to happen with regulation to make sure this stuff is safe? What has happened to small modular reactors to where you don't necessarily need these massive construction things? What do they bring to the table? So excited to hear that from the panelists. I'll touch on affordability really quickly because it's a really complex issue, but essentially nuclear is very expensive to build but very cheap to run. And if you put that in your grid system as a sort of stabilize your baseload energy type, should drive system costs down. It replaces something like coal, replaces something like natural gas. It's not filling the same role that you'll get from the more commonly seen cheap energies as your winds and your solars. They're companions, really and truly. You want a lot of diversity in your energy grid. And nuclear is something the state should certainly be interested in. That's why we're here, that's why we're on this panel. That's why we're all attending. So, I'll be quiet.
All right, I'm Jeff Steen. I'm from Idaho National Laboratory. I'm Associate Laboratory Director for Nuclear Science and Technology, which is kind of a long title, but it means I lead our research and development. How many of you know about Idaho National Laboratory? Okay, most, okay, good number of you. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little about it anyway, and maybe a few of you are not as familiar. So INL was established as the National Reactor Testing Station in 1949, so it's been around 75 years. But some of you may not know, since there aren't many reactors in the West. Actually, nuclear power was born in the West. It was born at Idaho National Laboratory, the National Reactor Testing Station. The first power plant was started up in 1951. So this technology that we're talking about, we've been researching and studying at our DOE National Laboratory, particularly INL, for almost 75 years. We've operated 52 reactors on our site. So a lot of the reactors that we're probably going to talk about tonight, we have experience with those reactors and the technology. The site has enabled testing. If you think about our current operating reactors, what we call light water reactors, tremendous amount of testing on the site to understand the safety and safety and operational characteristics. The same is happening today with these new reactor types. We have a number of reactors that will be operating again on our site. We haven't actually started up a new reactor in quite a long time, but we'll see in the next few years several reactors starting up. They'll start at very small reactors. That tends to be how you develop reactors. You start small and then you scale up to production facilities. And we are looking at all sorts of different technologies. The idea at a laboratory with a big wide open space to do testing and a lot of knowledgeable people is to understand the safety and the performance, the economics, how to make the fuel, what to do with the fuel after it's been irradiated. All of that's done, right here in the region. I know today it's 3.5 hour drive to get here. So 3.5 hours from here is really the world's premier R&D place for nuclear energy. So we're neighbors to the north, very interested in Utah and helping to address energy needs. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Galen Quantz. Back in 1979, I started my career in nuclear power in Canada. Ontario Hydro Nuclear was the largest owner-operator of nuclear power in North America, second only to the U.S. Tennessee Valley Authority. I've worked at power plants starting at 5 megawatt units, and then I was a commissioning and reliability engineer at a plant that had 4 800 megawatt units. We went big. What has me so excited about small modular nuclear reactors, things like the design-based accident that they have to be designed to be safe against. When you have a huge vacuum building and 4 large reactor buildings, a design-based accident is a 747 flying into the building. With a small modular nuclear reactor, you're dealing with a completely different set of scenarios. You don't have these hundreds and hundreds of foot-tall buildings. You don't have water, heavy water in our case, that could flash off into steam. It's a completely different paradigm. When I left nuclear 16 years ago, I was running the emergency preparedness exercise program, where I would have people from the US, from INPO, from Fermi, come and join our exercises and evaluate how were we doing. We also provided training on safe transport of fuels and cobalt. What I came to deeply appreciate was people, if they are given accurate, straight up information, the facts, then there can be a quality of question asked, a quality of answer given, and really useful discussion. I'm delighted to be part of this evening.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Pearson, and as the mayor mentioned, director of Utah's Enderfell Energy Lab. I've been there for 3 years, so if you haven't heard of it, it's a new lab in the state that's been put forth to develop advanced energy and bring jobs to rural communities that may be transitioning away from coal. And I was born 1 year before Gawain had that role in 1979, and went to BYU before Matt was there. Otherwise, I would have maybe had a different trajectory. But like our first speaker, my concern revolved around the inversion layers and the pollution, both here and in Los Angeles, where I grew up. And so I took an interest in pursuing advanced energy, went to UC Irvine to study hydrogen and fuel cells and solar power. But as I studied climate change and other energy concerns, I kind of took a holistic approach and looked at energy broadly. And so before I dive into details in the question and answer section, I just wanted to say something I see is very optimistic in terms of energy, because sometimes it's hard to define what that is. Sometimes it's just turning the lights on and off, but I like to view it as we all know, life would not exist without energy. Energy is the way life overcomes entropy, which is tearing life down. And in terms of what we accomplish as humans, 5% we do with our hands with the food we eat, of that energy intake, caloric intake, and the other 95% of all things human does is with machines that run on energy, either fossil fuels or renewable or nuclear. So it's not just turning on the lights, it's everything. And so the accessibility and cost of energy plays a huge role in every aspect of our life. But the beautiful story, as I see it, is that energy is not running out. We all know renewables will be around for 1 billion years as long as the sun's burning. And if you do the math, as I found out during my graduate school degree, nuclear energy can last for 1 billion years too. So when you look globally, a lot of the unrest and instability hinges on scarcity of resources and perceived scarcity. And when we realize that there's actually a world of abundance and the scarcity isn't there, it's just a matter of technologically tapping into it. I view this century as going to be the greatest century that the human race has ever seen. And it's going to be coupled to our ability to develop energy. And so nuclear energy is just possibly one solution, but it needs to have a good cost. And so my graduate work was in nuclear energy. I ended up not being able to do the solar and hydrogen I wanted to, and I ended up learning that it was very beautiful, but at our energy center, we're all of the above. And I did a 1-year stint with Senator Hatch in DC and put a lot of thought into how to have the right conversations based on Utah's history to realize the potential. I view Utah as being the nation's energy leader in the future. There's a lot of ways that can happen. And I almost wish we could have this conversation one-on-one and all in a circle, because everyone comes with different ideas and thoughts and concerns. But better to have this than just the top-down government approach. So I'm really excited that the mayor's put this on, and we're having this conversation. Hope to help wherever I can.
Thank you, everyone. So we do have a set of questions that have been sent in. And for many of these questions, they might be hybrid questions. If there were questions that were very similar, those were combined together. And Evan tells me that questions are still coming in, so we're going to try to get to all of those questions. Now, as I read off these questions, panelists, feel free to give a wave or something if you're ready to respond to that, and we'll try to get everybody involved as much as we possibly can. So, first on my list of questions is right up at the top. Let's just address this. What risks specifically relate to SMRs, and how can those be mitigated? What can be done to mitigate the risks of accidents involving nuclear reactors? So let's talk a little bit about the risks and the mitigation efforts. Go ahead.
I'll get started on that. So, SMRs, there's a range of SMR types, but let's think about, light water reactor cooled SMRs, which are similar in technology to our large plants. There's a whole series of hypothetical incidents that get analyzed for these types of systems. One of the most famous because of Fukushima is the loss of coolant accident. These reactors, you have fuel rods which get very hot. You have to cool those fuel rods. If you don't cool the fuel rods, they will melt. The innovation with SMRs has been to increase the ability to maintain cooling without off-site power or any operator interaction. So say you lose the ability to pump water, you lose the ability to inject water. They can go indefinitely. If you look at, say, the new scale design has what we call an infinite coping time. It can cool itself, it can shut down and cool itself forever. So these mechanisms like that, which are passive, again, I mentioned no operator interaction, are innovations that are being built into these reactors. They have inherent, what we call feedback effects. If the power tends to increase, it reacts to shut it down automatically with inherent safety. It's just the physics of the way it works. So there's been a real attempt in these SMRs to rely on fundamental physics rather than active safety systems to enhance safety. So, a little bit on the types of accidents we may be concerned about, and then, how those are mitigated. Very good. Dr. Memmott.
So I just want to take a step back for a minute. Everything he said is absolutely correct. But let's look at what we're worried about. What happens in a nuclear power plant is you take uranium atoms, you split those atoms, you create a bunch of new elements, and you're cooling off those fuel rods where the atoms are splitting, because it makes a lot of heat in that process. And really the concern here, the overarching worry is what kind of radiation dose are people going to get? That's what it really comes down to. When we talk about these accidents and these safety systems, etc., really the question is, are people nearby going to be dosed with unhealthy levels of radiation? And that's really the question, right? As we follow nuclear accidents that have happened in the past, like Fukushima, that's what people are concerned with. And the initial generation of reactor that we almost exclusively operate in the United States is a light water reactor. There's boiling and pressurized water. Those are two different categories. And essentially, it's what I described. You have solid fuel. The uranium is splitting inside that fuel. The water is passing by and heating up, and that generates steam. And this is all under a great amount of pressure. Now, the one thing that's different with nuclear power that you don't have with any other kind of power is even after you turn it off, you put control rods in, you stop the fission process, you're still going to make a little bit of heat. And so the concern is that heat will build up if you don't get rid of it. If you don't cool it off constantly, that heat will slowly build up until the temperature gets so high that you melt the fuel. And when you melt the fuel, those radioactive particles that you've generated can get out into the water. Because there's high pressure, they could get out into the environment. And that's the concern and the risk that people have had for a long time for nuclear. When we talk about some of these new small modular and advanced reactors, the game changes completely, because we know now, 60 years later, that this is a concern and that these are risks that our first generation of nuclear reactors have carried. And so when you look at the type of developments that scientists and engineers have made in nuclear engineering over the last 6 decades, it's incredible, the ideas and the capacities that have been developed to stop that problem. For example, there are types of reactors where they can completely have their operators walk away, have all the power to that reactor shut off, all the emergency cooling stop. In fact, one of the reactors at Idaho National Lab did this. And everybody can walk away and the reactor shut itself down and cool off. They call it walk-away safe. There was no risk of this high-pressure explosion of stuff or stuff being released anywhere. And so there have been amazing technological advancements. And as just mentioned, small modular reactors, that's a generic term that covers 8 to 9 to 10 different kinds of reactors. And each one has their own special technology and strengths and weaknesses and advantages. And you will see in the energy community, people are arguing all day long about which one is better. They're all amazing. They're all better than what we've had so far. And most of them so significantly reduce the risk of these significant accidents as to almost be unquestionably zero, but not, because there's always that risk. And so there are incredible advancements, not just for the small reactors, but we're seeing them showcased because the small reactors are what is popular and of interest today, that significantly reduce that risk beyond what we've seen to just incredibly small levels.
Sure, and we've heard a lot about the technological side of it. I'll speak to maybe a more practical challenge. Essentially, we've heard the safety of these things is not like previous regulations. Well, the regulatory framework for small modular reactors within the United States is still developing. It's supposed to be coming out of rules next year, actually. So what is going to be required from the federal government as far as safety and security of everything? We don't actually know yet necessarily. So the thoughts are the small modular reactors are so fundamentally different that the regulation should change with them. But that comes with a challenge. One of the key points of small modulars is they are modular. You can stack them up. You can do 1, you can do 5, you can do 10, you can do 100, right? You can build these things up. But what that means is your regulation needs to be flexible as well. And that is not typically how it is done. So Utah's actually at a really interesting place. We do not have utility scale nuclear power within the state. If this is a route we're going to go down, and we're going to do small modular reactors, those regulations that get developed, that needs to be a flexible system. It needs to still preserve safety, still preserve reliability, but allow for something like 1 reactor versus 3 versus 5. All that needs to be fleshed out. The supply chain, depending on the technology, a small modular still creates waste. What are we going to do about that? One site is much different from 1,000 sites, from 10,000 sites if you use if you do micro reactors. That is a real challenge that I think we're more than willing to meet, and Utah's actually in a pretty good place to do it because we do this forward thinking. We're aware that this needs to be a challenge, and we don't have a bunch of old regulations that we need to sort of bend and manipulate. We can look forward and say, all right, what makes sense now to do with whatever is going to be required. So it's a challenge, but it is one that I believe we will meet and plan to meet.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to our second question. Now, the second question is not really aimed totally at this group, but you might have a response here. So let's go ahead and wade into this. So this is a combination of questions, a bit of hybrid. So assuming a worst-case scenario occurs with a nuclear facility, would residents need to evacuate? And if so, what does that look like, and how would plans account for the limited number of roads Eagle Mountain has to move people in and out of the Cedar Valley? So let's just start with the first part of that question. What might a worst-case scenario look like, and what are we looking at there? How likely is that?
I'll start again, and others can weigh in. So, as I was talking through some of the scenarios that can happen, when you actually, in the regulatory space, there's a whole series of scenarios you have to look at. Worst case, there's the hypothetical worst case accident, loss of cooling, for example, our existing reactors, loss of cooling, which again was Fukushima was considered one of the worst case. But they have to look at, external hazards. That would be things like earthquake, and they look at historical earthquake data. I'm just going to go through some of this a little bit to understand what's looked at already, the worst case scenarios. So the worst possible earthquake, they look at tornadoes, worst possible tornado. They look at airplane crashing, and we already heard that from you. Even for a small modular reactor, they look at this. These reactors have a containment intended to protect the reactor, but also protect us if something were to happen. So they look at all these external events, the worst things that can happen. I mean, when you ask a question, think, okay, what if a giant meteor hits the Earth? And then, it's like, okay, that's probably going a bit too far. But there is through probabilistic methods, ways to look at these worst case accidents, and then you design for them. So such that the consequences outside of the reactor are minimal in terms of radiation exposure. One example of this that everybody's probably familiar with is 3 Mile Island. They had an internal accident. They had a loss of cooling, what was effectively a loss of cooling accident, and the system was designed. Very, very minor amounts of radiation escaped. They did do an evacuation, probably not necessary, but the issue was those types of events were so rare that it was, they followed the safest procedure that they knew. So when you look at small modular reactors and the advanced reactors, the probability of such events are low, and then the consequences of such events are low because of how they contain the radioactive material. The expectation would be for any of these types of incidents that I've talked about, that there would be no evacuation required. In fact, we can get into it later. You look at what's through the regulatory process with the NRC of reducing the emergency planning zone. So for large plants, they actually plan, how traffic has to move. That's done to 10 miles. For modern, SMRs, that is reduced down to the site boundary. So there's such confidence that there is no significant external release that you actually shrink that down to the actual site and not have to be concerned about evacuating. So maybe some others could add to that, maybe help explain that as well.
Yeah, so can I say something? Sorry, I didn't. So Jess was talking about these different scenarios that go into the design of nuclear reactors. And as part of the licensing process, all of those extreme circumstances, even to 747s running into your system, have to be considered. And considering all of those worst case scenarios, the regulator then says, okay, this distance is how far you have to be to not have a significant dose, have a dose that's not going to be harmful. And that zone goes into play as the exclusionary, meaning nobody can live or work or be inside that area. And in the worst case scenario, if you're outside that area, you are not going to get a dose that has any harmful effects at all, because it's well below the dose that we've seen causes those harmful effects by orders of magnitude. And so it's kind of inherently designed into the legislation, or the regulation, to make it so that you're not going to have to evacuate. They did at 3 Mile Island, but it was purely a precautionary measure, particularly because they were being overly careful and wanted to make sure everybody was fine. And looking back and based on the WHO reports and other technical data, it wasn't necessary, but it was done just in case. And so that holds true today, and it's even better. Some of these reactors that we're talking about are so safe, so much improved in their behavior against some of these extreme accidents, that exclusion zone has dropped to ridiculously small levels. Not because they're sacrificing safety, the standards are the same, it's just that they're so much more safe that distance you can be and still be totally unaffected is much, 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 much smaller. And so, particularly with some of the risk and concern with risk, that quantity in terms of will you have to evacuate is, again, very low levels and is already baked into the regulation. Is as long as you're outside of this zone, which they don't allow people to live or work within, then you will be fine. No need for evacuation.
Could I add one other thing? And, you might ask, okay, how do we know this? Certainly the regulators look at this, but this is where a place like INL, Idaho National Lab, comes into place. We've done extreme tests. You mentioned one of them, the passive shutdown test, but we've done other tests where we've actually put reactors through these types of events and took data on what happened. Today, we run 4 reactors on the site. We do materials testing to understand the fuels and in accident conditions what gets released, so that from an engineering perspective, we can design the reactor to prevent, for operating reactors, for materials to get out and be released. So there's experiments that are performed just, again, just north of here, where we get data that backs all of this up.
I'm thinking that Galen Quantz has probably contemplated this a time or two.
Yeah, given your background.
Oh, golly. A really important point to focus on, because I was already working for Reactor Safety Ontario Hydronuclear when 3 Mile Island happened. I was already working for Reactor Safety when Chernobyl happened. I would find it almost deliciously boring to work for Reactor Safety in this new environment of small modular nuclear reactors. Okay, those of you that cook, take a pot, put a lid on it, boil it. That water, as an energy transfer mechanism, has hazards associated with it. Because when it is superheated, when it needs to exit its contained space, it will shoot out steam. And that steam, in the case of a nuclear reactor, can form a plume that carries with it radioactive byproducts. The fundamental difference with small modular nuclear reactors is the heat transport mechanism is damn near benign. An example is molten salt. Molten salt presents hazardous environment to the materials containing it. But when the molten salt is no longer being heated, it just sits there like salt. It does not form a plume, such as what formed with Chernobyl and contaminated lichen for the reindeer hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So we've all lived through China Syndrome, the movie. Most of us were around in one form or another when 3 Mile Island happened. Many of us know about Chernobyl and certainly Fukushima, which survived 2 design-based accidents without catastrophic effects such as Chernobyl had. What we're dealing with here is so fundamentally different a design for nuclear power generation that I would encourage you all to ask questions based on what you already know, but be willing to understand this is such different technology. If that pot on the stove that you had boiling water in, pour 2 cups of salt instead, what's going to happen to the salt? Right, kind of real close to nothing. Emergency preparedness for the community. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission takes licensing incredibly seriously. I worked with the Atomic Energy Control Board in Canada, which is the Canadian equivalent for the NRC. They take public safety absolutely safe. It is sacred beyond everything. And that public safety starts with the design that they're talking about. Well-engineered design allows safe operation. Well-engineered design that considers the implication of external events, malicious events, accidental events, asteroids dropping out of the heavens events. That is what good engineering does, okay? And then the NRC looks at it and says, based on the reliability models, based on the event modeling, what is a credible, in a 1 times 10 to the minus 12 type scenario credible, release to the public? And then what is the best way to mitigate that release? In the case of the small modular nuclear reactors, you're talking in terms of hundreds of feet, EPZ, like hundreds of feet. Exclusion zone, that's, yeah, small. And then what the NRC does is they look very carefully at, is it possible? Is it probable? And what is the right response to protect the public? In the case of 3 Mile Island, it was damn stupid to evacuate. There are typically far more hazards associated with evacuation than there are with sheltering in place. We're starting a process. The NRC is starting the process to look at what is the right way to determine what credible hazards could exist. And then based on that, what is the right way to protect the public? But it's not a unilateral decision. People are involved in this. People from the communities are involved. Certainly up in Canada, we hold education sessions, we have regular exercises, we involve the journalists, we involve the schools, we involve the local universities. This is not a unilateral engagement. It is a explain what the engineering is, explain what the research is, know the science, because that's what the regulators base their decisions on. Okay.
So I sat down last Friday with Galen and was so impressed by how she explained these things that I said, you gotta come to this today. And I think the take home there and that what I've learned is that you can actually digest these things in ways that anyone with any background can understand. Maybe it takes a couple of times, but it's doable, the way Matt and Galen described it. And so the encouragement there is to ask those questions to get to that level. And the experience I had was when the New Skill was trying to do their UAMPS project, and they said, we have a reactor design that if there was a Fukushima type accident, all the power could go out and we could walk away and the reactor would shut itself down and cool itself. And being an engineer, I believed it, but I played devil's advocate and said, I'm not going to believe it until I understand it myself. And so I listened to an hour-long presentation, asked them questions, and then they said, well, that doesn't really work because you don't have a valve here. And they're like, oh, we forgot to put that in this image. And then they said, yeah, it does. And then walk them through every step until I was convinced. And then I felt a comfort level, like, oh my gosh, this does make sense. And I think that every nuclear reactor technology provider has that that story to tell, and anyone can understand it if they ask the questions. So I just offer that as encouragement.
Great, thank you. And on the second part of that question regarding evacuation, if David Uliberry, our city emergency manager, were here, I'd probably turn this over to him. But just real quick, so we understand how evacuations work. You know, they're generally regional, but let's say if it were a citywide evacuation for any reason, there would be several different agencies and groups involved well beyond the city. So certainly Unified Fire Authority, Utah County Sheriffs, possibly even Camp Williams would be involved. Eagle Mountain has six emergency exits, and let's see, what was I going to say? Oh, and just so we put this on the record, Eagle Mountain has no fault lines. So we really feel like if there were a major earthquake event, Eagle Mountain would become the fallback, because much of the fault line runs across the Wasatch Front, probably most of it just east of I-15. So, so the ground here is stable. Are we 100% immune from emergencies? Absolutely. But certainly it would be a coordinated effort should an evacuation be needed for any event. The next question, how are nuclear reactors protected against natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, and extreme weather? Maybe we've touched on this a little bit, but Joyce?
I told you that I worked at Intermountain Power. It was constructed knowing that a fault zone was within spitting distance. So you can construct a modular reactor any way you want to, but it would be the NRC, as mentioned, would consider the fault zones. They look at everything. If you today decided, hey, we're going to build a molten salt reactor, you're not going to be able to do it. You would, the federal government wouldn't allow you. They want to get their dime out of it. And so if you vote, if it comes to a vote, you could do that. You say, hey, we want to build a molten salt reactor. We want to be on the grid. So you already have Intermountain Power that I told you about was a coal-fired power plant. The inversion that Jeremy and I are discussing or have discussed it's a product of having mountains on both sides, mostly, and you wouldn't want to change the geology in the state. Nobody wants to change the geology in the state, but at the same time, you want to be in control. You're doing exactly what you need to do, which is be self-educated. Even if your self-education led you to, like mine did, hey, I want to be involved with this company, great. You're still going to you're just one person and one vote.
So is there a way to dive into this further without getting too technical?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. When I went to China, I was at Westinghouse.
Is his mic on? I'm sorry, it doesn't sound like. Can you hear him?
Can you hear me now? Is it on?
Yeah, there you go.
When Fukushima happened, when that earthquake occurred, I was at Westinghouse and we were intently watching the screens and following. And the first images after the earthquake in the Fukushima region were just astounding. Because what you saw was absolute devastation, right? Cars on top of each other, trees toppled, houses completely flattened. And there were exactly 6 buildings that were completely intact. Any guesses as to which those 6 buildings were? It was the 6 nuclear power plants. They were totally fine. And then later we had the flood come, and when that giant tsunami came, the reactor buildings were still fine, but it knocked out the power. And since those reactors weren't equipped to be able to operate or to safely be shut down without power, then that's where the problem began. But they are designed to withstand these massive events because the regulator ensures it. And so one thing you can rest assured in is the license will not be granted until they've looked at all these different possible events and said, yep, the risk to the public is is effectively zero beyond this boundary, as we talked about before. And so that's incorporated into the design and licensing process, and they won't allow you to build unless you can prove that that's the case.
All right, if on-site nuclear storage is contemplated, what can be done to mitigate environmental contamination due to hazardous waste generated by nuclear power generation?
Sorry, I talked a lot, but when it comes to nuclear waste storage, I think we do it incredibly well. If you've seen the storage, what they do is when the fuel first comes out of the reactor, they stick it in a pool for 10 years because it's so radioactive, they can't handle it really well. Well, in this pool of water, they then, after 10 years, stick it in a cask that's lined with steel and concrete and just enormous and massive and robust. And the amount of tests that they've done with these casks is astounding, dropping from 50 stories and airplane impact and car wrecks and train wrecks, and these things come out completely unscratched most of the time. It is absolutely incredible, and the fuel is stored in these casks. And I will be honest, I would be very impressed if anybody managed to break them, if nature managed to break them in the time frame they're planning to be stored in. They are incredibly strong and incredibly secure. And ideally, at some point, we figure out what to do with the waste long term. And there's actually technical solutions where we can take that waste, we could pull it apart, we could sell it, because every single piece of nuclear waste is actually valuable, believe it or not, for a variety of applications. We use radioactive isotopes for medicine or for industry, and we use some of the stable isotopes because it's gold and platinum and palladium. If we could separate and sell all those pieces, we would have no waste left and we'd have a revenue stream. We ended up doing that with oil, right? We started taking the kerosene and throwing everything else away, and it was a problem. Well, then we figured out how to use every single piece of the oil, all the way down to the heavy wax crude that we took and used to make asphalt and makeup, etc. We can do that same thing with nuclear waste. And the technology exists. It's a matter of polishing, perfecting, and developing the economic case for that process. So in the meantime, we can store them very safely. We're not going to do it forever. People are worried about 600,000 years of storage. We don't need to do that because the technology is rapidly advancing to the point where we can take that waste, we can pull it apart, separate it, sell it, and end up with nothing left.
Maybe I'll step back a little bit. One thing if you watch The Simpsons, what you think of waste is this green goo leaking out of drums. And I can say, I know where we have spent fuel, it's not like that. The spent fuel is solid, it's not a liquid, easily moved around, maintains its shape and geometry, can be pulled from the pool, put into one of these casks that Matt talked about. We have several of these casks at the lab, we monitor them, look at the lifetime. NRC has approved these for decades of storage, and so they're very, very robust, concrete and steel. So just to understand what the waste form is, it's the solid rod of fuel for the current reactors. For other reactors, it might have a slightly different form, but it would be solid and not some sort of liquid leaking out of drums that might be fixed in your head if you watch The Simpsons.
Okay, well, time is just ticking on. We're already halfway through the clock, but we still have a lot of questions. Hey, the next question really has to do with cooling and water use. So we've all heard about the massive water requirements to cool nuclear reactors. Given our arid conditions in Eagle Mountain, what innovative coolant solutions are available with smaller microreactors that can alleviate this challenge here locally? Who would like to speak on coolant and water usage? Yeah, Joyce.
So, I don't want to keep going back to Intermountain Power, but who's heard of the Sevier River? I mean, the federal government said, Intermountain Power, okay, you're going to have a cooling capacity, some coolant. So I talked to the guy at Intermountain Power Association. He said so I don't know if you know or not, but Intermountain Power is shutting down. It's old, but we have one customer. In Utah, you have IPA and UAMPS. And UAMPS has a lot of customers. IPA has one customer. Essentially, they have LA has about 99% of the power from Intermountain Power, and the water is a cooling concern. Enough of the concern that I thought, hey, I better talk to these people and find out what they're going to do. This is live energy I'm referring to. What are they going to do with their cooling capacity? If you do like you're doing, being self-taught a little bit, you investigate everything you can. Hopefully you're not in an echo chamber where you're talking to yourself, but you want to investigate everything you can, which is a solid fuel is one thing, a liquid fuel is another thing, and they both have streams of waste associated with them. With a liquid fuel, imagine running your car on a solid fuel. It would be tough to do. They've tried it, not very doable. So we put gasoline. I remember my sister got a Pinto, which my father at the time was into building or repairing cars. An auto repair shop is what he owned. And he saw his daughter, my sister, says, I'm going to get her a Pinto. Pinto didn't have a great reputation. If you hit it, it would explode because it was full of gasoline. There was just not a way to hit that car and have it survive the impact and have it not explode. And that's what my sister was driving around in. But, so the cooling, one of the things that I found out about Applied Energy was they didn't need the severe river. I mean, they needed air. It's been done once before in Oak Ridge. So the Oak Ridge was just a big toaster. There was a big radiator. And so the way that was cooled was with the salt, it was fuel, and the air. So.
Okay, so the air cooled is a different technology. Yes.
Yeah, one reason why, this question comes up, the current plants were all built near large bodies of water on purpose. And the reason why you need so much water is that, the plants are thermal plants. So about a third of the thermal generation gets converted to electricity. About 2/3 has to be rejected to the environment. And so the easiest way to do that is have a lake. In fact, you go to Google Maps and look at nuclear plants. A lot of them are near lakes, and they just run water through. One's called once-through cooling. Uses a lot of water. Most of it's returned back to the lake. But if you actually look at the throughput, it's pretty large. If you go, rather than running water through to cool the condenser, which is on the secondary non-radioactive side of the plant, you use air. You can reduce it by 90%. So just by that choice alone. If you go to other technologies, this would be for a light water reactor. If you go to other technologies that use salt, or they use sodium, or they use gas, you could use a different power conversion cycle that needs no water at all. It's called a Brayton power system rather than Rankine, if you want to get technical. Doesn't require any water from the plant itself, and it uses air to reject heat. So you can get down to very low water usage by the choice of the technology. It's just the current plants, they design them to be near large bodies of water. So it's a misconception that all nuclear requires a lot of water. In fact, like I said, if you design it, there are many different designs. You can design it such that it requires almost no water.
Very good, thank you. Now this next question changes up a little bit. We're going to talk about the business model of a nuclear power plant, because obviously there's a huge investment into it, and ultimately, there are a lot of power generation options, but it's going to come down to our pocketbooks a lot, and how do we make this affordable? So let me see if I can kind of rephrase this question here. With the business models for reactors, let's start off with this part. Does the community need to help finance these projects or bear the burden of cost overruns? So how are they financed? Can anybody speak to that? Jeremy, are you ready with that?
There's one really simple comment that, I forget his name, the CEO of Bill Gates' nuclear company, TerraPower, who was in Salt Lake just 2 weeks ago at the Advanced Nuclear Summit. And at least in terms of his project that he's doing in Wyoming, and Pacific Corp has aspirations to possibly do it under in Huntington. The CEO said that we understand we're going to make money in the future, but our first of a kind reactors that are going to be really expensive, we're not going to put on the ratepayers. We're going to absorb that cost ourselves with an eye on profits in the future. And just in terms of my view, I believe that's how it should be done. I believe that as we transition away from fossil fuels, we do need to be developing these advanced technologies, but they shouldn't be on the back of the ratepayers. They should be an investment decision by these companies or a national decision federally. And that's just my opinion. That's one way it can be done.
And Jeremy, would that hold true also if there were cost overruns?
I guess it would all depend how it sets up, and these individuals in the panel would know more about that structure.
So it really depends on what the vendor or the reactor company negotiates and does, et cetera. Like you mentioned, TerraPower fully intends to absorb those costs. One thing I wanted to point out is nuclear has a reputation for being very, very expensive. And that's been true historically, but a major contributor, according to a big study at MIT, to that cost is the fact that we stopped making them. We can't make them anymore. And so trying to get back into the game means we've got to rehire people, we've got to retrain people, we've got to relearn how to do this. And that's particularly true for the large light water reactors. South Korea never stopped making these reactors, and they are now making them at the same price that we would expect to see coal plants and other kinds of plants. And so they have the expertise to make them cheap, and the cost overruns and schedule overruns are not an issue. So that's symptomatic more of the decisions we made in the US than actual nuclear power. It's sometimes hard to separate those two ideas. And so having the right development of supply chain and expertise is a key thing that needs to be done. And there's a couple options the government can and should and has often offered to subsidize that. The company itself can and should absorb those costs. And once we get good at that, and Jeremy called it the nth of a kind, or not the first few, then you end up getting good at building it, and it gets quite cheap. The other thing you can work on is changing the design up. When you have these large light water reactors, you're talking about having the biggest pump to run this thing, or a forging that needs to be a single piece that can only be forged in 3 places in the world. And those kinds of things make it so it takes a long time to get that piece. When we were at Westinghouse, we waited for years for one of our major forges, beyond what we should have. And then it also makes it very expensive. And so changing up the design and going from the economy of big scale, which nuclear did in the past because it turned out to be cheaper, to the economy of mass production, which small modular reactors actually facilitate. Now you can change the economics game, where instead of making these giant plants that require all kinds of time and weight and money, now you can make a factory that can make a lot of these all at once, and the cost goes down. And rather than cost overruns, what you'll see is cheaper power than anywhere else. And a lot of models have predicted and validated this idea.
So, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in and say, so this is all like upfront cost reduction. It should be cheaper than we think it will be. There are genuine innovations in how you could actually run these things. Something that I said earlier is microreactor. Single building scale, right? Why would you want to do that? Could be for advanced manufacturing, could be for heat. One of these things that small modulars will facilitate is sort of co-location, co-uses, where someone wants the heat. You've got a data center, their energy is going to go up and down. It's always online, but it does vary. Fit someone to that variance, absolutely. More than willing partners looking for that energy, looking for that power. So you can sort of build up a whole vertical ecosystem around reaching every scrap of these things, really. And then there's also sort of innovative business strategies around like private investment, and then the public utility buys it later. There's a whole bunch of financial strategies. There's cold to nuclear conversion, will save on transmission costs. There's a whole lot of push for driving down costs that is truly innovative.
So to put a finer point on the consumer side of it, should consumers brace themselves for higher energy costs, or is there a chance that this could make power more plentiful and therefore cheaper? Do you have any commentary there? Yes, Dr. Mann.
So every single reactor designer will tell you theirs is going to be cheaper. That's just what they say. Some will, some won't. We fully expected the AP1000 to be cheaper than everyone else, and it was not. And there were a lot of reasons for that. However, there are some technologies, it's been mentioned a couple times, the molten salt reactors, that genuinely will be cheaper because the simplicity of operation is so different and so simple. I mean, to give you an idea, there was an operator at Oak Ridge that talked about how he tried to make their molten salt reactor fail. He did everything, I don't know how he was authorized to do that, right? How do you go and, he did his best to try and make this thing melt down, fail, go out of spec. He couldn't do it. And so you didn't need all these extra systems to try and keep it in line. And so there are reactor types that genuinely will be cheaper, and that will come down to a decision by the city, by you guys and the vendors to try and decide and do your homework and figure out which one of these is going to be the best choice. And usually you'll get a warning beforehand, right? NuScale thought they were going to be very cheap. They were talking about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And by the end, it was significantly more than that, more than 3 times that. And so they had the option to say, never mind, that's not what we're looking for. We don't want it to be that expensive. You should have that opportunity and not be locked into a more expensive price if you're careful and wise and talk to the different vendors and look at the designs. And there will be options, I can guarantee you, that will be cheaper for you than current power. People will love to come to Eagle Mountain because the power is cheap, utilities are great.
Dr. James?
Yeah, I was just gonna, you got to the point at the end. When if you decide to go this way, you'll be the decision makers. The business model will be put in front of you, whether it's an investment-driven model, which is actually really new for nuclear, not so new for other places, but the model that you talked about, versus other models. And you will have a say in that through how your power is provided and regulated. And one other comment on discussion NuScale and the AP1000s at Vogtle. Those were first of a kind, no supply chain. There's going to be a premium there. That's where the case with, say, TerraPower and Natrium, they said you will not be paying, the first of kind premium. We'll pay for that through our investors. And so you're looking for a business model like that. I'm not a business person, I'm a research person, so I like the technical stuff and bring the cost down. But those of you that are business savvy will be able to understand the model and whether the power provided will be low cost and competitive.
Very good. The next question, how are nuclear gases prevented from escaping into the atmosphere?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So all, just generically, all the, when you have fission events that Matt was talking about, they produce some of the fission products that are produced when the uranium splits or gaseous. And then you talk about barriers to prevent those from release. If you look at the current plants, the fuel is contained in cladding. It's a metal tube that's sealed. That's the first barrier. And then that's contained into a reactor vessel that's sealed. That's another barrier. That's contained into a containment system that's sealed. So there are multiple barriers to release. Nearly all the gas is just contained in that first barrier, which is the rod. If you go to different types of fuel, they'll have similar physical barriers for release. And this is carefully analyzed by the NRC to understand the release pathways and properly release. And this is where we really do a lot of work at INL. We have reactors where we can take the temperature of that fuel and that cladding up to failure and understand at what point will those gases be released. We will have measured that data. That goes into the design models, and you design the reactor such that you don't hit that point, that temperature, which, say, the cladding or any of these physical barriers would be breached.
All right. Can you name an example of a town where SMRs and nuclear waste have been in close proximity to residents? And what is the long-term impact on residents, water, and soil health? Go ahead, Dr. Moon.
So commercially, we don't yet have SMRs, and so we can't necessarily say that. We can't say relative to the large reactors. There are a lot of cities where they are close to nuclear reactors, and the residents are right there, and the waste is stored on site for a lot of these. And data has shown that the amount of radiation you get from living next to a nuclear plant is an order of magnitude less than the amount of radiation you get living next to a coal plant, and somewhat less than you get from living next to a natural gas plant. And so generally what I've seen is residents that live in areas where there is nuclear power initially have been a little leery, but then have loved living next to that plant with very little opposition because of the tax base, because of the financial benefit, because of the cheap electricity, because of the reliable electricity, and the general great quality of utility providing that they receive. And so almost ubiquitously, the support for nuclear, near nuclear, is high, in the 90s plus.
Can I have you repeat that just to make sure I heard it right? So you're saying that there is less radiation exposure from an SMR specifically than there would be with a natural gas or coal plant?
That's correct.
Okay. Dr. G?
Yeah, the reason for that is coal has trace amounts of uranium. So when you burn it, you get ash and you get emissions that's just released to the environment, where in a nuclear plant you contain that. Now there is some examples where reactors are located in highly populated areas. Where you went to school, MIT, they have a reactor right in the center of Cambridge. It's 6 megawatts, so it's not a large SMR, but it's a pretty powerful research reactor located right in the city there, doing research. Most people don't even recognize it there, but it meets all the requirements, all the safety requirements for being in a populated area. Very common to have research reactors. Historically, the large reactors were located in a more isolated area, but like we talked about earlier, the exclusion zone for small modular reactors, because of the design improvements and the safety, are being shrunk down such that these advanced reactors or SMRs can be located closer to populations. And the site boundary, the dose that you receive at the site boundary for those is the same as 10 miles away for the large reactors. So you've shrunk this down so that it can be located closer to population, and also industrial sites, data centers. There's a lot of interest in data centers, or if they're factories that would use heat or produce hydrogen, for example, you can locate closer to those locations.
Well, this next question ties into that, and you probably already hinted at it, but let's address this head on here. What happens to property values, insurance premiums, and taxes when nuclear power plants are constructed nearby?
I think I hinted on that a little, but initially, depending on the population, it will take a hit at first because of the concern over the nuclear. Funny story, the MIT reactor, I worked above that for 4 years every day, and they were getting all kinds of concern and worry about it because it was right in the heart of Cambridge, and so they painted it all in sky blue, and everybody somehow forgot about it. So, initially there's the concern, but then again, as that reactor reliably generates power and as the safety is validated and as it kind of becomes a very boring event, as was mentioned, then you build in the tax base that comes from that and the jobs that come from that and the financial benefits and the reliable electricity, because your blackouts, I mean, these reactors operate 100% of the time. Most of the year, maybe 18 days out of 2 years, they stop. It's an incredible reliability that you see. Shortly thereafter, the popularity of the land and the value of the land recovers and goes much, much higher than it was before. So it ends up being an asset once people stop being worried about it, and whether you have to paint the reactor blue or just teach people about the reactor, that's the key. Once it's understood and the value is seen, then your property values will see that.
And Tim?
Yeah, I'll add 2 more data points onto that for you. There's a study out of Japan that said, hey, look at this nuclear municipality. We have a nuclear power plant here. What is the average value here from our tax income, from our consumers? It was about 11% higher on average than their neighbors. In one case, it was up to 65% higher. So they drive tremendous value to the local area. A different study looked at when a nuclear power plant shuts down, what happens to your property value? It goes down, actually, because you lose that tax base. That's what they found. So they're a huge economic driver when they're there, and when they go away, you're going to miss them.
Very good, thank you. Okay, let's move on to some of our life questions that Evan has received. How long does nuclear waste remain hazardous?
Can I talk about this? I hinted at it, but I want to actually give a full answer here. So nuclear waste, as we know it, is really 3 different pieces. The first is leftover uranium. 95% of the fuel is still there by the time we're done. The second piece is some of the uranium will absorb a neutron and not split instead becomes plutonium, americium, curium, these elements that are larger than uranium. We call these transuranics in the industry. That's the second thing. So you have the leftover uranium, you have the transuranics, and then you have the leftover pieces of when the uranium is split, called the fission products. And that's 52 plus different elements. Many of them very, very valuable. As an example, medical isotopes come from exclusively splitting uranium, and Moly-99 is an example. We use that to image the body. It's worth $30 million a gram. Think about that, $30 million a gram for this material. So those are the three different pieces of nuclear waste. And the big problem piece is that transuranic piece, the plutonium, the americium, curium. They're great big heavy atoms, and they'll be radioactive for 300,000 years. The fission product piece, those 52 elements, some are not radioactive, some are highly radioactive. It just depends on what piece we're talking about. And the longest that those will last is about 300 years. But again, most of those are very valuable products that you could take out and separate and sell to the industry, to hospitals, to a variety of different places. But if you didn't touch that at all, it would only last 300,000 years. And then there's the fresh fuel, where ideally, if you could get the other stuff away, you can put it back in the reactor and run it. The reason why we don't do that, why do we stop when there's still 95% of fuel left? Well, it's because those fission products, those leftover pieces, build up so much that they start to block the neutrons and keep the fission from happening, so they can't run that fuel anymore. You may have heard about transfer processing. What that really is they're taking that fuel, they're pulling out the transuranics, and they're pulling out the leftover fuel, and they're sticking those back in the reactor, and then they're taking the fission products, and they're encasing them in glass and burying them in the ground. Because it's a tiny, tiny volume of those, only 5%, or much smaller. And so there's ways to deal with this, so you're not dealing with waste for 300,000 years. There's technical ways to do it, and there's even economical ways to do it. And just like oil and gas, as I mentioned, I'm convinced that with some time and effort and focus, we can make that happen. Right now, there's some legal changes that need to be done, right? We made the choice a few decades ago that we weren't going to mess with this waste, that we weren't going to reprocess it because we were worried about what would happen, and France slapped their way to the bank because they did it. But that technology exists so that if you don't do anything with the fuel, sure, it'll last 300,000 years, but you're letting a valuable resource go to waste. If you do stuff with that fuel and work on recycling like you can do, you can end up with waste that doesn't last long at all or doesn't exist because it's been sold as a product.
Jeremy?
So my PhD was in nuclear fuel recycling, so this is a passion of mine. And as Matt had mentioned in his earlier comment, the example with petroleum, how we used to just get the kerosene out and dump the rest in the river, and then found uses for all the oil. Another similar example is, as I learned when I was a kid about the Native Americans and using every part of the buffalo instead of just taking the hide off and throw the rest of the way. And I see that happening in the next few decades. So more likely than not, in my mind, every radioactive element is an asset, and it's going to be utilized just like the petroleum and the buffalo. I did the math to check it out. The highest value in there is actually the most radioactive stuff that can be made into batteries that will last 10 years or more, and we already have them operating on our rovers on Mars and other autonomous vehicles. And so we're working at the lab with the two leading technologies developing, the companies developing the technologies to separate these value isotopes. And so I view Utah as actually finding the solutions and that industry potentially being commercialized in Utah. And so that's where I see it going. But one other little tidbit, let's just say we aren't able to do that and we have to store it, or certain things still need to be stored. One example that's fun to look up is in order to understand what will happen when you store it and how these radioisotopes can migrate over time. We don't have those 100,000 year, million-year time scales of data that the NRC would like, but there actually was a natural reactor that occurred in Africa, and which went critical, and scientists have gone back and evaluated how the isotopes transported over time. It's a really interesting story. It's called the Oklo reactor, and there's actually a nuclear company that named themselves after that uranium deposit. And so there's scientific methods of quantifying if we do store things underground, how they disperse and what the risk is.
Thank you. Obviously, safety is a huge concern. Right? So this next question, how can we feel safe about an SMR when the NRC has already greatly reduced safety requirements for them? Okay.
I'll take that. I think that's a fallacy. The NRC doesn't reduce safety requirements. That's never what the regulator does. Rather, there's a confusion over the fact that the safety requirements are the same, but less is required to meet that same safety level. Never, never, never will you see the NRC reduce safety. That is the antithesis of what they're there for. Rather, what you see and what people talk about is less stuff is needed. That's true, not because it's less safe, but because they're smaller, they've got a lower source, they're more boring, which is a good thing, which means less is needed for them, and so therefore, the same level of safety that you would expect for the large reactors is there, it just takes less. It's like boiling a large pot of water on the stove versus boiling a little tea kettle. There's less amount of total heat in that water, and less needs to be done in the case of a spill to keep people safe. It's the same idea. It's not that they're less safe, but I want that to be very clear. The SMRs are not less safe, and there's not less safety requirements. It's exactly the same. It's just that the way to get to that safety is easier, simpler, and cheaper because of the fact that they're smaller, better technology.
Okay.
And I'll add a tangential point to that. What is a surrounding thing that might drive this, right? Who's got a phone? Who remembers rotary phones, yeah? The state of sensor technologies, the state of diagnostics, how much data you can gather, how much certainty you can have about your environment has exponentially increased over the past couple of decades since nuclear has been around. So how certain can you be that you're at a certain pressure? How certain can you be that you're at a certain temperature? That certainty is through the roof, and you can utilize all of that the same way your phone does, right? The same way your miniaturization of technology has. There's this whole background progress that's happened in your materials and in your sensors and in data communication just in general that sort of can be built into these modern safety systems where it's something that is modern. It's something that came out this year as opposed to 60 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, right? The state of technology is not remotely the same. So you can have much more certainty in any measurements you're taking and in any modeling that you do of these scenarios. Our computing power has gone up so much, right? We can do more, much more with sort of the surrounding ecosystem around these plants.
This next question is an interesting one. What protections are in place to prevent cyber attacks or terrorist threats?
Yeah, maybe I can talk a little about that. So first of all, for the current plants, they're actually very well protected because they primarily use analog systems. You know, for future plants, you know, that will use digital systems, you know, they can use traditional methods on, you know, being air gapped from the network, protective systems, being actually active cyber system. We do a lot of work on this at INL and have a methodology for it. You know, consequence-driven cyber-informed design. So we actually, the key is to, when you design the reactor, you build this in at that point, those production layers. And we have systems where we develop this and test it. You know, they're actually, you know, trying to attack it, see if you can get in and how secure it is. So there are known ways to do that.
All right, anyone else want to touch on that? Is that adequate?
Agreed.
Agreed. There's a bunch of innovations going into it. There's a bunch of planning going into it. It's a large driver of the national lab thing. It's a big concern in sort of the modern era in general.
I will say, I can add a little more. You know, this is also reviewed by the NRC. They've been very cautious. One reason why we still use a lot of analog systems because they're taking their time to understand the different failure modes and how the protection will work. Even the existing plants that are analog are now starting to convert over to digital systems because we've achieved that level of protection for the plants.
Very good. Jeremy, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say, if anyone is really curious about this topic, we have a business owner who's on our board, Steve Ellis, in the audience, who develops technological solutions for cybersecurity. So go find him. He's right there in the middle if you have any questions. Sorry to put you on the spot, Steve, but I couldn't resist.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating topic for sure, and one that's not going away. Yes.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, it's not just nuclear plants that need cyber protection. There's a huge enterprise, and it's probably your business as well, looking at this. It's just not nuclear that needs protected. All of our critical infrastructure needs to be protected. So when you look at the investments and the capability development, it's really extensive.
Definitely. All right, for our next question, what is the time frame from groundbreaking to power output? Dr. Mem?
That depends on the reactor and the reactor vendor. Wide variance. If you're talking about small modular reactors that are factory made, that time could be as short as 6 months. If you're talking about these large reactors that are 300 plus megawatts, like the TerraPower reactor, you're talking optimistically 3 years, realistically 7 years. And so really, again, there's some homework to be done here because that number ranges greatly. And in my opinion, there's an advantage and disadvantage to the new nuclear reactors. The advantage is they're engineered to be really safe, really effective, really cheap. The disadvantage is we haven't done it yet, so there's going to be a learning curve. We're going to screw it up a time or two before we can get it down to really, really fast, quick operation. The old reactors, we really know what we're doing, and so we really effectively know how to order and put these things together, but they're so big and so complex and so regulated in every aspect, including what angle the rebar is in, that it just takes a lot of time. So the question is, it really varies, and that's something you'll want to do your homework on because some designs are better than others, and there's going to be challenges and benefits for each.
So chances are the first few reactors in the country will probably take a little while, but the pace should pick up as that progresses. All right, can you discuss how newer reactors can be made with processes that don't create weapons-grade materials? Dr. Meth?
So, sorry, I'm going to take a lot. We didn't take them after, but I can give an example. There's been a lot of thought that has gone into this exact question. The unfortunate thing is what mankind makes for beneficial uses, others will invariably turn to nefarious purposes if they can. And so there's been a lot of thought on how do we prevent this. And technologically, we can do some things to make that happen. An example is, Joyce brought up these thorium reactors. Thorium reactors are fantastic in a lot of senses. One of their features that really does well is the fact that that conversion of thorium to uranium, which has to happen in the reactor for it to run, means that you're getting other types of uranium and other isotopes that will block the use for weapons. The military worked on making a weapon with the thorium-type uranium, uranium-233, and it was very difficult. And I'm being somewhat colloquial, but in their summary they said it's easier to steal material from Russia to make that bomb than to try and make it with thorium. And so there are technologies that will allow you to really block that use of weapons-grade material from a reactor. And this is one thing that the regulator is very careful about. They are very careful to make sure not only do you have safeguards to prevent access to that material, but they want to make sure that you are accounting for every ounce of that material to make sure that you're not accidentally losing it. And so there are a lot of both technological and operational safeguards in place to prevent access of that material for weapons. So it's very unlikely that a power plant will be the source of the material that will be used in that way. It's much more likely to come from other sources such as Russia or other places where that material is much more easily accessed. And I don't mean to beat on Russia, that was just the example they used in the report. So.
Well, and this speaks to how the technology has evolved from where it came from historically, right? Dr.
Yeah, well, the part I would like to add, all these reactors need enriched uranium to get started. And you can get into recycling and talk about that, but the reactors we're talking for the foreseeable future will use enrichment. That enrichment's all below 20%, which is not weapons usable, so the commercial enterprise is producing material that can't be directly used for weapons. As Matt said, somebody can try to take that technology and separately go try to do something different. But if you look at the commercial enterprise, it's by design and by its nature using materials, especially the enriched uranium, that's not weapons.
All right, this next question, I know the answer is going to be it depends, but maybe we can get a little more specific. What size of property is required for a nuclear power plant? So we have a couple different technologies.
It depends. It depends.
It depends, okay.
So obviously the size of the reactor, if you look at a gigawatt reactor, they're operating, they sit on, still with actually for the amount of power generation, it's a relatively small amount of land, but you're talking about hundreds of acres, plus then you may have some exclusion zones. You get down to SMRs, you're talking about maybe 10 acres. You get down to a microreactor, you're talking about 1 acre or less. So it depends, it scales with the size of the reactor. Certainly the technology makes a difference regarding the exclusion zone that we talked about earlier. In these advanced reactors, you can shrink that down and get it closer and use less land. Rarely, I think never, would we consider nuclear to be land, something that you're concerned about the amount of land that it's taking because it's such an energy-dense source that you're talking about relatively small areas.
Ken?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and get a fun Google, you can look at land use intensity by generator, and it'll say, hey, how much power did you get out of this resource? Nuclear substance, it is far and away the least amount of land you can use for any energy, even counting containment zones, essentially. Something like solar, something like wind, something like natural gas, it beats all of them by orders of magnitude. It's truly remarkable. You don't have to take mine for it. They have a whole bunch of fun visualizations that you can see. So I recommend you give it a check out. It takes effectively no land.
So it depends is a good answer. Let me kind of constrain that. So on the large side, you have some reactors that require square miles, multiple square miles. But those reactors make gigawatts of electricity. On the flip side, on the small side that I've seen, you have micro reactors like this where the entire footprint is 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet, and it makes 12 megawatts, which is enough to power 12,000 US homes. So that's kind of the range you're looking at for the variety, and depending on the design, there are a variety of spaces in between those amounts that are used, but that's kind of the range you can expect to see.
Okay, Wayne, do you have anything to add?
I agree with what's been said.
Oh, okay. Very good. All right, we'll move on to the next question. How many jobs are created in the operation of a reactor?
Do we want to say another it depends?
Yeah,
'Cause it depends.
Can I take it depends? Yeah, it'll depend on how big your reactor is, depending on how many you do. Typical metric is about per 100 nuclear jobs, you'll get about 250 surrounding jobs. How many is at a site? 500 to 1,000, but that varies entirely by location. Somewhere like Sellafield in the UK is not nuclear power necessarily, it's a multi-use site, it's got like 10,000 employees. So huge possible range that could be employed. Small modular reactors, I assume.
But you look at it, if I can add, you look at their current power reactors, which are, again, it depends. These are big reactors, 1,000 megawatts. They have 300-400 people employed. Building reactors, again, it depends on the reactor technology. These factory jobs, or if you're building it on site, it can be for a large reactor, thousands of people. For a smaller reactor, you're talking about hundreds of people. For operating it, again, you're looking to range from tens to hundreds, depending on the size of the reactor.
All right, our next question. Some of our people have read articles about research that suggests that there are higher cancer rates near nuclear reactors. Can you speak to that?
There have been numerous studies on this. You're exactly right. You can get on the internet and find them. I don't think if you look at, say, the IAEA and others that have done studies, I don't think there's any definitive evidence that points to that. You can always, I guess, I'm not an expert in this area, maybe others can comment on it, but if you always go looking and draw a circle around a particular area, you can say, aha, I found it. But if you actually step back and take a look, there's been no clear evidence of that.
There's an exception to that.
Okay.
The emergency preparedness zone, which didn't actually exist as a defined zone around Chernobyl, but the people who lived proximate to Chernobyl, where their personal safety was not looked after, have a much higher rate of all forms of cancer. A different counter-argument In the 60s, the IAEA sent a medical physicist to study a high radiation beach in Sri Lanka. It was Ceylon at the time. And the annual dose picked up by people who lived on this beach. It was a village of people who lived from food from the sea. The annual dose was 5 rem a year. 5 rem is the annual dose that I was allowed as my maximum as a registered atomic radiation worker in Canada. He went to this beach to study because this population had an unusually low incidence of gastrointestinal cancers compared to villages with exactly the same diet, but a much lower radiation background, ambient background. There is no absolute black and white. With the exception of Chernobyl, I'm not aware of any data that has correlation of cancer incidence proximate to nuclear power plants. One of the things that is found, at least in Canada, is because of the safety measures, the focus on safety, the focus on good health, housekeeping, all aspects, the average health of an atomic radiation worker in Canada is higher than that of the average citizen because of the focus on safety and health and accountability, managing shift schedules, all that good stuff.
Thank you. The next question, what can we anticipate about what happens to a reactor when it reaches its end of life?
So typically what happens is when you reach the end of life, before you start, the reactor owner has to have a plan for how to take that reactor back to a greenfield. Take away all the components, take away the fuel, get it back so it is a back to nature park type situation. And this is something that has to be part of the licensing plan and the strategy to get a reactor built. So when you have somebody coming in and talking about building a nuclear reactor for you and generating nuclear energy, that's not going to be on you to take care of. That's part of the company's responsibility. They have to have a financial model and strategy to be able to cover that. They have to be able to have the technical know-how or the partners to be able to take care of that. And the idea is when they're done, when they hit the end of life and they decide they are finished, that they have a strategy that's paid for, that will take care of all those components, the structures, the fuel, so that what's left for you is the natural end as it was before.
That's been done at some of our reactors. In fact, what's been happening to our current reactors is they've been going to the NRC and getting our license extended. We have reactors that the original license period was 40 years. They've been extended to 60 years and now some to 80 years. So they're such a valuable asset, they're going to keep them running for a while. But we have plants that have been fully decommissioned. The site's been returned back to, as Matt said, greenfield site that can be used for other things. Now that can take a while if it's a large plant because you have to deconstruct a large plant. If you're talking about an SMR, particularly a microreactor, it can be moved a lot easier because you just have less, infrastructure there.
Our next question is, why did the NRC amend its regulations to create an alternate emergency preparedness framework for SM?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about that. So the regulations that the NRC had for reactors were really set up for large reactors, and they had a fixed emergency planning zone, 10 miles. Every reactor was written in the regulations, your emergency planning zone is 10 miles. Well, it turns out, as we've been talking about all along, the reactors we're talking about are smaller, they're not gigawatts, or maybe, if it's an SMR, 300 megawatts, or if it's a microreactor, 10 megawatts. That when you look at the requirements that set that 10-mile zone, you could actually meet that by moving that in, like the boundary of the reactor site. So what they've added is a more, what they call technology neutral, or more flexible approach rather than it's just fixed because we only had one type of reactor. Achieves the same level of safety as the current 10-mile, but based on these aspects of the reactor design and, power level and those things, it makes, technically sense to be able to scale your emergency planning zone to that. So you would not, have a very small reactor and then have to actually plan out to 10 miles when the consequences are,
Can I say something really quick?
Yes.
I would say it's analogous to fires, right? If you have a giant bonfire, there's going to be a certain distance where eyebrows don't get singed. That's going to be a different distance than a camp, right? That's kind of the comparison we're talking about. These enormous, high heat, high intensity plants compared to the smaller ones. It's not that they're changing how safe they are, it's just the fact that it doesn't make sense to stand 10 feet away from a candle. You wouldn't feel it or see it, right?
Okay, building upon the SMR discussion, can SMRs be made in America with 100% American resources?
Yes.
Yeah, they generally can. If you look at the large plants, one of the primary components that we no longer can make in the U.S. is the pressure vessel because it's so large. When you shrink the plant down, the size of the plant down, there are a couple different aspects here I'll get into. One is smaller, so you can make it in the U.S. You may choose to work with international companies. Or if you go to some of the designs that we've been talking about with salt or some other coolants where the pressure is lower, you don't need a forged vessel. You can use a fabricated vessel, which you're basically rolling steel and welding it, at a very high level of quality, but that can be done in the U.S. In fact, there are several companies planning to do just that, to manufacture the components that are difficult in larger systems in factories within the U.S.
Our next question, how can you be so sure SMRs are safer when one has not been built and operated in the United States?
So I would say they have been built and operated. The difference is commercial. They have not been used to make power for money. But Idaho National Lab has, what is it, 53?
52. We'll be 53 in 14
reactors with some comes, right? And Oak Ridge ran a small modular molten salt reactor in essence. And they have been built and operated. So we have a lot of good data to back that up, not to mention, as Tim mentioned, computer models that are so well done that we can validate those using data that they are incredibly accurate, and they demonstrate that yes, this can be done. So I would say that it's not quite an entirely fair question. They have been built and operated. The difference is, have they been done commercially? And the answer there is no. But there are a whole group of people that are working on doing that now based on the performance of these other SMRs that have been operated throughout the last decades.
Yeah, and you can even look at the military, right? We have nuclear-powered submarines. We have several nuclear-powered, I believe, aircraft carriers. These are mobile nuclear power sources with sailors in and around them, nuclear technicians on site. As far as we're aware, going fine, right? So these things have been operated for years at this point, with plenty of data, plenty of test runs, plenty of sort of stress testing, real-world stress testing. And that's actually where you get a lot of nuclear operators will be from the Navy, from people with direct expertise, will sort of come back into civilian life. So they're not particularly new.
Then I'll add, depending on the reactor technology, we for 75 years have been looking at this technology, doing experiments, doing simulations. Some of the fuel forms, if you look at for gas-cooled reactors that we call TRISO, which are small, very robust particles, we test those in our reactors, understand how they perform, and are building data, as we go along that underpins the safety evaluations for these reactors. So we are testing them. We may not, we're just testing the key components. Primarily the fuel is what we're testing, or the coolant system. We're doing a lot of that work.
And that's very much the good news story. Every new technology has a maturation curve that it has to go through. And a lot of the maturation of the small modular nuclear reactors has been happening one subsystem at a time. So because these subsystems, the TRISO fuel, because each of these subsystems has been going through focused testing, at least from my understanding of how engineering works, my background is commissioning. When you do successful testing of subsystems, it appropriately should give you confidence that the overall integrated system, its performance can reasonably be predicted. And then you build the first scale, evaluate its performance. And all of this is happening before it becomes a publicly available asset for use. So from my perspective, I like the maturation curve related to small modular nuclear reactors has such a long history. This is not technology that has been getting rushed into service.
All right, this next question. Are local first responders equipped to respond to a disaster? Now, we could ask our first responders, probably be the best way, but maybe I can lead off. So I do sit on the board of Unified Fire Authority, and I have not asked this specific question on how well trained they are on nuclear materials specifically, but I know that they are well trained in across the board hazmat situations. But there may be additional resources that would come to bear. Can you speak to any of those?
So if somebody wants to build a reactor, part of that processing and part of that licensing process is to train the local responders and make sure everybody's up to stuff, making sure they're equipped, making sure they're aware of risks, making sure that they are very well comfortable and prepared to accommodate anything that could happen. And that's part of the requirement of that reactor.
That's in addition to all the preparation done on site. That's separate. If you're talking about off-site, I suspect I'm not a first responder. There's already training that's being done on transportation of hazardous materials to have accident. In fact, where I grew up in farm country, the biggest event is when we had anhydrous ammonia tank car coming through that had a leak. So we had to, responders had to be trained for that. Well, I'm sure you're trained for those types of transportation accidents. If radioactive materials or transport, be trained to be ready for that.
Our next question, since molten salt is highly corrosive, what materials will be used to prevent structural degradation over time? Dr. Mill.
Sorry, this is my pet project. This is what we've been doing at BYU. So the premise of the question is right and wrong at the same time. Molten salts historically have had a challenge with being very corrosive. And for a long time we just said, oh, that's salt. Well, recently, with studies that have been done at BYU, but also in other places like MIT and national labs, we've discovered that there's actually a culprit that makes the salt corrosive, and that is oxygen and hydrogen. It makes hydroxides and oxides that cause big-time corrosive. And what we did is at BYU, we demonstrated that we could actually take that salt and we could remove most of the oxygen down to where there's just 5 parts per million or so. And when we did that, it was kind of fascinating. We took salt that Oak Ridge had prepared, and we took salt that we had cleaned up and taken the oxygen out of it and put them both in nickel crucibles. And the salt that still had the oxygen in it within minutes had corroded to the point where this clear liquid salt became black and tar-like, filled with nickel corrosion products, right? Whereas the stuff we'd taken the oxygen and hydrogen out of remained clean and water for days. And so the first step is to get the salt right by taking out the oxygen and hydrogen. You can remove a vast amount of corrosivity. Once that's done, there's a lot of materials that actually have been commercially developed and tested and have ASME standards, meaning we know very well how they work in all conditions, that you can use to contain that salt for up to 60 years. So,
Very good.
Sorry, I got to pause so turn on the mic. Yeah, we've been recycling fuel at INL now for decades, and we use the salt-based process. It's got radioactive materials, and it's the same salt that's been in this vessel for decades. And if you control it, just like Matt said, it actually isn't corrosive. That's been the experience. But you do have to control the chemistry, and we do know how to do that. If you don't, you just don't do anything, just like salt on your vehicle, it will rust. But we know the science behind it.
Okay, this one may take a bit of interpretation, but how often does a reactor need to be serviced?
It depends.
It depends.
On the reactor. The current reactors, they operate on what we call 18 or 24-month cycles. So the idea, it depends on the specific reactor, but every 18 to 24 months, assuming some part doesn't break during that period, they will have a maintenance outage. They'll replace the fuel. That's the great thing about nuclear. You can run 18 to 24 months for those reactors, and then we'll do maintenance at that point in time. Other reactors, when you get into the SMRs, you take all the knowledge on modern design. Depending on the life of the fuel, they could even go much longer than that. 5 years, 8 years, depending upon maintenance schedules. Just like your automobile, you have a maintenance schedule. You'll have that in a reactor. Many of the components are not in the nuclear part. In fact, probably most of the components aren't in the nuclear part. Those can be worked on, pretty regularly. But it's all carefully scheduled. Maintain a very high uptime. The capacity factors for these reactors are over 90%. So if you account for, just for these maintenance schedules, it's very well coordinated.
Any more questions? Okay. How do you ensure mining, milling, and processing of uranium will be carbon-free and not harm community from waste? Okay, so this is about a little bit about the mining side of it.
So we actually have one of, I think, the only milling processing site in the country in southern Utah, in the blending area. And the answer again is that's part of the regulation. They have to go to the regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they have to demonstrate that their process is not going to generate the radioactivity and that it's not going to be a risk to the public. They have to show how they're going to store the tailings, how they're going to store the uranium, how they're going to deal with all these products. And they have to show that the risk to the public is negligible and within acceptable limits, and that's a part of the licensing process. Now when it comes to carbon-free, that's a different question because that's not something historically that's been required. We're trying to consider that additional cost of the environment right now. And really the options for getting the heat and the energy that they need to go through that process is limited. And in fact, if you look at companies that are doing mining, that are doing drilling, that are doing really intensive extraction activities, do you know where they're almost exclusively turning for their power source to be carbon-free? Nuclear. Chevron, Valero, Exxon, all these companies have gone to various nuclear reactor vendors and said, look, we need to be carbon-free. The only way that we see that that can happen is to have a small modular reactor on site, giving us the electricity we need. And so it's an interesting circular logic question where if we're really going to go carbon-free, they can't rely on solar and wind. It's not constant enough, it's not power dense enough. So they're going to nuclear as the option to decarbonize. So.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. That's all very true. The other thing to realize, if you look at the actual carbon emissions from nuclear, there is small carbon emissions from mining, milling activities, but it also, given the amount of power produced from the uranium mined, it's such a small quantity. If you look on any charts, you can Google these charts on what's the amount of CO2 produced per energy generated. Nuclear is always at the very low end, actually, on par or lower than wind or solar, because they also have components that have to be mined, and it's not uranium, but it's rare earth metals and other things like that.
I'll just add in. Mike, maybe? There we go. You can, so that's from an emission side. You can do the same thing for mining intensity if you want to look at that. How much do you have to mine to actually produce the power that you want to produce? Again, similar case there. Nuclear is so energy dense that it essentially blows everything out of the water. So if you're concerned about mining, even more than solar, even more than batteries, nuclear is your least mining intensive option for longevity, for environmental security.
Okay. We are out of time. There is one question in here that I think is worth taking a moment to address because it's an understandable one. And with energy options, and like I said at the introduction, Eagle Mountain is looking at every technology we know of as options, as we educate ourselves and look for the best opportunities. But with solar and wind being options, why go to nuclear? Why aren't those enough? And not meaning to attack those, but I think we need some context, right? There's downsides or question marks in everything. Tim?
Sure, I hinted about this in my intro a little bit, we got it with a little bit of the capacity factor argument of nuclear, but essentially, wind and solar intermittent, everyone gets that. Why can't you just build them ad infinitum? You get to a certain point where the amount that you have to build and the required energy storage you have to build becomes essentially just as costly as anything else. You're tripling how much you need, you're quadrupling how much you need, and that's before you even consider reliability as a metric. When you build storage nowadays, it's not used for energy storage, it's used to kind of shift power on a daily basis. It's not there next week. It's not there even necessarily the next day a lot of the time. And your grid has to operate all of this at the exact same time. None of it's in isolation. So all of it's moving up and down together. All of it's matching your demand at the same time. So the risk, you might say, when you get to these really high penetration variable resources where you can't control how much fuel you get, your dispatchability, one of the state's primary objectives, is what happens if it's cloudy for a week? Not necessarily an issue, but it does become an issue. You start getting that with wind, actually. You can look at, the DOE has a bunch of phenomenal studies on transmission. You can watch a cold front move across the nation, and you can see it kill transmission efficiency, essentially. So as you start scaling up the grid, a necessary downside to the lower power density is you need more land. You need way more land. You need way more transmission, most importantly, in these future scenarios, which puts you at more risk of environmental considerations. So you're getting cheap energy, but at the cost of reliability and variability. And to counter that, you need more and more storage. So it kind of goes in a big circle. The more of it you build, the more storage you need. The more of it you build, the more storage you need. The more storage, the more transmission. And you sort of have to move all these pieces together because you can't run any of it in isolation.
Thank you. Well, for me, these 2 hours have gone by very quickly, and it feels like we could just keep going, should we choose to do so. But we have come to the end of our scheduled time, and please join me in applause for our panel. We hope this is the first of many conversations, and we'll have different groups, different settings, but continue the discussion along. Definitely appreciate all of the resources that have been brought forth to make this happen. Thank you for being here, and everyone have a good night and a safe drive home. Thank you.